This is Paul Atwal, Shifty for Run It Once. I'm making my first video again in quite a while. In this time, I've done quite a bit of studying and improving, and my results have been quite good in this time as well, and they've reflected that improvement, which has been nice. And today I just want to go over one of the ways that I approach poker off the tables and how I go about studying. So in general, on an average day, I will just grind and mark as many hands as I possibly can. What I'm usually looking for in terms of marking hands is spots that I'm unaware or unsure of in terms of PIO. So I want to get a better feel for how a certain spot should look in equilibrium from either player's strategy. So it's not even necessarily about my exact hand sometimes, even though I will mark it if I'm not sure what to do with my exact hand, but maybe I just don't know how my range as a whole should look in a given spot, what sizing the majority of my range wants to use, or maybe my opponents and that sort of thing. So I tend to be quite liberal with this, and yeah, for the obvious reasons. You just want to study as many spots as you can and be as sure as you can. Oftentimes I will restudy and revisit spots that I've studied before. I'll get into that a little bit later. And then the other reason that I'll mark hands is just for exploitative reasons. So if I want to ask a friend what they think, and less so with PIO. I'm mostly going to be focusing on just more of the theoretical stuff today. So after I'm done grinding and marking hands, I will go back and set up a script in PIO Solver and sim all the hands that I wanted to sim from that day. So maybe like 5 to 10 hands, and I'll just let it run after I'm done playing for the day. And then the next morning I just usually get up, start reviewing those hands while I'm waking up and working on my coffee. Certainly not ready to play right when I wake up, so this usually helps me get mentally focused and ready to play and thinking about poker the right way and that sort of thing. So I think one of the things that people struggle with, especially early on, is just how they're meant to study poker. So, like for example, beginners, you often hear them think about poker in terms of just like hand strengths. So you'll often hear the classic what should I do with ace king when I miss the flop, or how do I play low pocket pairs out of position. These type of the things that we sort of can scoff at a little bit, but they're fair questions, but they're just obviously not quite thinking about things the right way. And then you have the other end of the spectrum where you have slightly more experienced players that are maybe new in PIO or have been playing around with it for a little while, but they're not using it effectively. So they'll get bogged down way too much in the details and be overwhelmed. So maybe they're looking at a single race pot where they're in the big blind, they check call flop, and then they're looking at their turn check raise range against another c bet. And it's like, oh, I should be check raising this combo, this flush draw 78% of the time, but when I have a flush draw with the 9 blocker, I should be doing it 45% of the time or something like this. And they're just spending all this time trying to memorize these things, and it makes it very, very difficult to actually walk away with anything tangible, something that you can actually apply. Similarly, it can be, that's more or less, it's just difficult to apply and actually interpret that information in useful ways. What I try to do is study lines, and so this kind of reminds me a little bit of in terms of how beginners think. Like they think about how to play a certain hand class, whereas I try to think about more how to play a specific line. So like for example, the one that we'll be looking at today is big blind versus in position single raise pot. When the in position player c bets, big blind check calls, turn goes check check, and then what kind of strategy we're meant to use as the out of position big blind player. So in general, if you're trying to still if you're still relatively new or you're playing low stakes, what you want to do is start with the most common lines possible. So of course that would be one really good example would just be big blind versus button on the flop, what your c betting strategy should look like and what your check raise strategy should look like. So that obviously that spot's going to come up a ton, and it wouldn't be all that effective for you to spend a bunch of time trying to look at four bet pots after it goes check call, check check, and then river check raise or something like that. It's just really not going to have nearly the impact on your win rate that something like a more common spot will. So the one that we're looking at today is obviously a little bit more specific than just a flop c-bet, because I think a ton of that content already exists, even on Run It Once as well. Like, yeah, there are quite a few videos just talking about c-bet spots. So what you want to do when you're trying to find lines to study is be specific, but be vague enough, I guess, for lack of a better term, that you can actually extrapolate that information elsewhere. So what I mean is, so again, going back to that 4-bet pot example, let's just say where it goes check call, check check, and then river check raise. You just can't extrapolate what you're going to find there to that many spots, except for, that same. You can extrapolate it maybe to other lines, like the same 4-bet pot, same line, and similar textures. But again, like I mentioned before, the issue with that is just not going to come up all that frequently. But similarly, you can't also be so vague with your line that you can't extrapolate it, or that you can't actually find any patterns. You want to be basically specific enough that you can actually identify patterns. So I wouldn't want to say that I just want to study check call, check check bet lines, because they're going to work differently, let's say in 3-bet pots versus single raise pots, and depending on positions and that sort of thing. So I feel like big blind versus button single, or big blind versus in position single raise pots, check call, check check bet lines are specific enough, but even still a little bit too maybe not specific enough in the sense that different boards might just function completely differently. And for that reason, I've actually picked out 3 or 4 hands that have very similar board textures and that are likely to function similarly on the flop and the turn. So we should hopefully actually be able to identify some very clear patterns. So again, yeah, this is just the line that we're going to be looking at, as I've already mentioned now a couple times. So the things that we're going to look for are what sizings, or sizing, if we can just use one, is used by the out of position player, the weakest hand that we bet for value, and the strongest hand that's bluffed. I just like having a few of these key points down, just so I don't just skim over the sim and whatnot and just look for my specific hand. It's nice to just have a few questions in mind that we want to have answered. Okay, here I've got my Poker Tracker 4 filtered for this exact line. This is only when I'm in the big blind versus an in position player, and it's a single raise pot. And of course, check call, check check turn, and then we have an opportunity to bet on the river, but we haven't necessarily bet. I've also picked out a few hands already that I think I want to look at for this line. Okay, and we can just run through these, and I'll just talk about my thought process. So we have a cutoff raise. This hand will be totally fine as a 3-bet, but mostly calling. Flop, we face a 1/3 c-bet. This is likely to be a very high frequency, if not entire range c-bet, and this is a very common strategy, against which our hand is going to work as a continue with the backdoor flush draw and ace high. Turn is obviously quite good for us, and predictably our opponent checks back. And now river, we have the nuts and we have a decision. So first question is, how many sizings do we want on this river? I would assume that this is going to be a spot where it's relatively useful to have more than one sizing. I would imagine that when the in position player checks back the turn rather, that he is infrequently going to have a hand better than, say, King 9 at best. Yeah, I would imagine that a lot of his King X is going to bet on the turn. The most common strategy on this type of turn would be to use an overbet. So yeah, his value region is likely going to look like something like King 9 plus. For that reason, he's going to also have a ton of hands such as 3x, pocket deuces, pocket 4s through pocket 10s, and the sorts like that. So we want to be doing quite a bit of betting ourselves and trying to extract value from those worst pairs. Of course, 6x, 4x, maybe even some ace highs. So I would imagine that we're meant to do a decent bit of block betting with a Jack X through marginal king X region, and then probably some more of like a 3/4 to pot size bet, something like that, with medium to strong king X, and then possibly some overbets with a nutted region like this. And then of course that requires a decent bit of mixing as well. You need to put some of the stronger combos into these smaller sizings at some frequency, just so you're not just so your opponent can't just raise super thinly and effectively clairvoyantly if you know what your exact range is always capped at. And of course you gotta also mix in some checks. So what I want to know is how frequently each of those actions is going to happen, and if in fact my estimate with the sizing scheme is correct as well. I decided to go with the overbet this time. I do believe that this will likely be the most frequent strategic option in this position. I have studied these spots a little bit before, but I haven't looked at these specific hands. And our opponent calls with ace-jack. Seems like a perfectly reasonable play by him. I think he played his hand well from top to bottom.